He went down the stairwell with no real reason. But there, on the cold steps, someone was waiting, someone who would change his life forever. Julian hadn't planned to stay out so late, but the office had swallowed more hours than expected, as it often did. By the time he reached his building, the sky had already turned into a heavy shade of slate, hinting at rain that never quite came. The city felt unusually quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that rustled discarded leaves across the pavement. The building stood the same as always, tired bricks, peeling paint around the doorway, and that flickering light bulb above the entrance that had been threatening to give out for the better part of a year. It greeted him like a sigh. He stepped into the lobby, greeted only by the groan of old hinges and the faint echo of his own footsteps on worn tiles. The elevator, as expected, had given up sometime that morning. A handwritten note, barely taped to the door, confirmed its current state of uselessness. Julian stared at it for a second longer than necessary, gathering the energy to climb the 5 flights to his apartment. His bag felt heavier than usual, not with weight, but with the inertia of long days and longer silences. On the second-floor landing, he heard the shuffle of footsteps behind him, followed by the quiet creak of the entrance door closing. Someone else had come in. Julian didn't turn around at first. He didn't expect to, but then a voice, low and calm, drifted up toward him, a simple, "Need a hand?" Not invasive, not overly familiar, just present. He turned slightly and saw a man standing by the stairwell with 2 grocery bags in hand. His face was unfamiliar, but there was something disarming in his posture, relaxed, confident, like someone who had never been in a rush in his life. Julian hesitated before nodding, allowing the man to catch up. They climbed the stairs together, wordless after that brief exchange. There was something oddly grounding in the shared silence. Julian glanced sideways more than once. The man was older than him, perhaps by just a few years, with graying stubble along his jawline and the kind of composure that came from someone who knew how to navigate long pauses. By the time they reached the 4th floor, the light above them began to flicker, casting both of their shadows against the peeling paint in erratic patterns. Julian found it oddly poetic, the way the silence between them felt fuller than some conversations he'd had that week. The man paused beside the railing and gently set his bags down. Julian did the same. "I'm Victor," the man said finally. His voice matched his demeanor, steady, soft-spoken, like the kind of person who only raised it when absolutely necessary. Julian responded in kind, keeping his voice low. They didn't shake hands. There was no need. The connection wasn't physical, not yet. It was built on glances, on the unspoken understanding of 2 people who had both known loneliness intimately. The hallway air smelled faintly of dust and something floral, probably from the neighbor's air freshener. The bulb overhead blinked twice before deciding to stay lit for a while. Julian leaned against the wall, letting his back press into the cool concrete. Victor stayed beside the railing, hands resting casually on the metal bar, as if he'd done it 100 times before. They didn't speak again until Victor reached down, picked up his bags, and gave Julian a subtle nod, a gesture that was less goodbye and more until next time. Julian watched him disappear up the stairs, the echo of his steps softening with each floor. He remained standing there for another full minute, staring at the light. It flickered again. He didn't mind. For the first time in weeks, he didn't mind. Later that night, as he sat on his couch with a half-eaten dinner beside him, Julian found his thoughts drifting, not to work, not to emails or deadlines, but to the sound of that voice. To the way Victor had spoken, like the silence was just as valuable as the words. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him without needing something in return. It was a strange feeling, that small shift in the chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in, slow and certain. A presence, not a memory yet, but maybe the beginning of one. The following days unfolded with an unexpected rhythm. Julian continued his routines. Early mornings filled with coffee and emails. Quiet evenings wrapped in the faint hum of the radiator. But something had shifted. It wasn't a disruption, more like a thread woven quietly through the fabric of his days. The thread had a name, a face, and a voice that echoed in his head longer than it should have. He didn't look for Victor. That was what he told himself, at least. But he also didn't avoid the stairs, even though the elevator had resumed working. He didn't time his comings and goings, but he noticed when the front door creaked open downstairs, or when someone's footsteps echoed in the stairwell. And every time, his heart would lift slightly before he even checked if it was him. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. Their next interaction happened by the mailboxes. Julian had returned from the grocery store, cradling a loaf of bread and a carton of soup like fragile artifacts. Victor was already there, crouched slightly, flipping through envelopes with the focused expression of someone hoping to find good news hidden in ordinary paper. He looked up, nodded once, that same calm presence in his gaze. Julian nodded back. They stood there, side by side, neither reaching for words. The silence didn't beg to be filled. It simply existed, companionable and strange. Victor eventually broke it with a question about the weather. A blonde? Arme topique. But even that felt different coming from him. Gentler, as if he were inviting Julian to speak only if he wanted to. Julian did. And before he knew it, they were standing in that tiny space for far longer than necessary, talking about nothing and everything. About the rain that hadn't come. About the creaky radiator pipes. About a cafe around the corner that made passable tea but terrible muffins. Afterward, Julian climbed the stairs more slowly than usual. His groceries hung forgotten in one hand, and he kept replaying the conversation in his mind, not for what was said but for how it had felt. Easy. Natural, like something old and familiar, even though they had only just met. The pattern continued over the next week. Brief encounters turned into pauses. Pauses turned into exchanges. They talked in fragments, in the lobby, by the stairwell, once even outside by the recycling bins. Each time, Julian felt himself stepping a little closer to something he couldn't quite define. He learned that Victor was an architect, that he worked freelance from home, that he liked jazz but hated coffee. Victor learned that Julian worked in UX design, that he hated silence in the mornings but needed it at night, that he sometimes forgot to eat when he was deep in work. These details accumulated like dust in the corners of their shared building. Small, quiet things that built intimacy without effort. One evening, Julian passed Victor's door just as it opened. They both froze. For a second, neither said anything. Then Victor smiled, a quiet curl of the lips that didn't reach for effect. It was the kind of smile that settled instead of flashed. Julian smiled back. The hallway between them felt narrower than usual. The overhead light flickered once. Victor stepped aside, letting Julian pass. But for a moment, Julian didn't. He just stood there, as if suspended in that sliver of time where a decision could be made. He said nothing. He walked on. Later, lying in bed with the covers pulled to his chest, Julian tried to name what he was feeling. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It wasn't longing exactly. It was anticipation wrapped in caution. A hope that hadn't quite made it to the surface. In Victor, he saw something steady, something unhurried. And in himself, Julian recognized the quiet craving for someone who didn't need to fill the silence with sound. The building creaked around him. Somewhere down the hall, pipes shifted with the changing temperature. Julian stared at the ceiling, wondering if Victor was still awake. If he was thinking about that moment in the hallway. If he, too, felt the shape of something beginning to form. Whatever it was, it didn't feel threatening. It felt like a door slowly swinging open, revealing a light he hadn't realized he missed. The forecast had been vague, promising only the possibility of rain, but by evening, the sky had darkened into a dull bruise, and the first drops began to fall with steady insistence. Julian stood in the entryway of the building, dripping and motionless, keys clenched in his hand, his coat clinging to him like wet paper. The city behind him dissolved in a veil of water, its sounds muffled into distant hums and occasional tires hissing through puddles. Inside the stairwell, the familiar scent of dust and old wood greeted him like a well-worn coat. He climbed one flight before he saw the light, faint and amber, spilling onto the third-floor landing. As he reached it, he saw Victor seated there, just above the stairs, a thermos beside him, and 2 steaming cups waiting patiently. He looked up, the corners of his mouth curving into that quiet smile Julian had come to recognize. Victor said nothing, just gestured toward the empty space beside him. Julian hesitated, the dampness still clinging to his skin like nerves. Then he sat. The warmth from the tea seeped into his fingers, slowly chasing the chill from his bones. The storm outside grew louder. Wind scraped against the windows, and distant thunder echoed like a forgotten memory. But inside the stairwell, there was calm. Not silence exactly, but calm. A kind of sacred stillness born from being fully present with another person. They sat like that for a long time, letting the sound of the rain fill the spaces between them. The conversation came slowly, one topic spilling into the next with the ease of people who didn't need to prove anything. Julian spoke about the city, how it used to feel like home, and how lately it didn't. Victor listened, not interrupting, not offering quick fixes, just hearing him. When it was Victor's turn, he talked about why he had moved into the building, how he'd grown tired of too much space and too few conversations. It surprised Julian how easily he opened up, how natural it felt to speak without rehearsing his thoughts. He spoke about how long it had been since he'd felt seen, really seen by anyone. He didn't cry, but the truth sat heavy in his voice, and it was enough. Victor reached out, briefly, to refill his cup. His fingers brushed Julian's hand. Not accidentally, not lingering, but just enough to be felt. That touch sent something unexpected through Julian. Not lust, not desire, but connection. A reminder that he existed, that his presence mattered to someone sitting beside him in the dim light. The conversation turned to quieter things. Books neither had finished, places both had meant to travel to but hadn't, the odd shapes water made as it streamed down the stairwell window. Time slowed. The rain didn't stop, but it softened. Julian found himself watching Victor's hands as he spoke, strong, deliberate, and expressive. He noticed the flecks of gray near his temples, the way he sat slightly hunched when he listened closely. These were small details, but they etched themselves into Julian's memory, as if he needed to keep them for later. At one point, Victor laughed, a low, quiet sound that felt like it had been waiting for the right moment. Julian didn't even know what had prompted it, only that he smiled back before realizing he was doing it. Eventually, the thermos emptied. The storm began to drift into the distance, no longer pounding against the building, but whispering around its edges. Julian didn't want to move. The warmth of the tea, the soft glow of the overhead bulb, and the presence of Victor beside him made the stairwell feel less like a passageway and more like a place to stay. When Victor stood, Julian almost rose with him, but he paused. Victor gathered the cups, glanced at him briefly, and gave a quiet nod, not asking a question, not expecting an answer, just sharing a moment. Julian watched him walk up the stairs and disappear around the bend. He stayed sitting for a while longer, watching the window, listening to the soft patter of rain easing into silence. That night, when Julian returned to his apartment, he didn't turn on the lights right away. He let the dimness wrap around him like a memory. The stairwell, the conversation, the warmth, they lingered in the air as if they had followed him inside. He didn't know what any of it meant yet, but he knew how it felt, and that was enough for now. In the days that followed, Julian kept expecting something to change. Not in the world outside, which carried on with its gray mornings and creaking buses, but in the quiet rhythm of his own mind. Instead, everything appeared deceptively normal. He went to work, answered emails, walked the same familiar routes. But beneath it all, a subtle current tugged at him, a persistent awareness that something had shifted. He hadn't seen Victor since the night of the rain. Not because he was avoiding him, exactly, but because he wasn't sure what to do with the closeness they had shared. The memory of it felt too vivid, like a photograph he couldn't put away. Every time Julian passed the third-floor landing, he slowed his steps, glanced at the window, half expecting to see a thermos waiting there again. He began taking the elevator more often. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't empty. It felt thick with unspoken things. Julian caught glimpses of Victor in passing, a distant figure locking his door, a silhouette outside the building smoking late at night. Their eyes didn't meet, but Julian felt them brush, almost like a whisper. One evening, after a particularly long day that left him with more questions than answers, Julian stayed inside. He turned off his phone, ignored the blinking notifications, and sat in the dark with a mug of cold tea. He wasn't sure what he was avoiding, Victor, himself, or the truth somewhere in between. A knock at the door startled him. It was soft, almost hesitant. When he opened it, Victor stood there with a calm he hadn't seen in days. His expression wasn't demanding or urgent. It was steady. Julian stepped aside without speaking. Victor entered, pausing just past the threshold. They didn't say anything for a long moment. The quiet settled like dust between them. Then Victor moved to the small couch and sat, his movements unhurried. Julian remained standing, unsure of what to do with his hands, his breath, the heaviness in his chest. The distance between them felt both trivial and immense. The first words came slowly, like stepping stones across a river neither of them had wanted to cross. Victor asked if he was okay. Julian gave a vague nod, but it didn't carry much weight. The silence returned, and with it, the moment that stretched too long to be casual. Julian could feel it building, the pause that begged for acknowledgement. Something in the air shifted, charged with a tension that wasn't fear but anticipation. Julian finally sat down, but not beside Victor. He kept a space between them, as though that distance offered clarity. He looked at the floor, at his hands, at the wall. Anywhere but at him. He said that he didn't know what he was feeling, that it made no sense, that it wasn't planned or wanted, but it was real. Victor didn't move, didn't interrupt, just listened. Julian admitted that he had thought about that night, more than once, that it had stuck with him in a way nothing else had in a long time. When he finally looked up, Victor's eyes were already waiting. And then came the pause, not the silence of strangers or awkwardness, but the kind of pause where everything inside two people settles into alignment, where nothing is said because everything is already understood. Victor reached across the space between them and placed a hand gently on Julian's, not with urgency, not with expectation, just presence. Julian didn't pull away. That touch, simple, warm, still broke something loose inside him. Not like a crack, but like a breath he had been holding finally let go. They didn't speak for the rest of the evening. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. They simply sat there, the air between them finally quiet, the pause still holding. And for the first time in a long while, Julian didn't want to be anywhere else. It had been a week since that evening in Julian's apartment, and yet the memory of it lingered with stubborn clarity. Not because of anything that had been said, there had been so little of that, but because of the quiet and the hand and the pause that had held more than either of them could have expressed. In the days that followed, they resumed their separate routines. But something in their interactions shifted. No longer accidental, no longer guarded. When they crossed paths now, they didn't glance away. They didn't rush. A nod turned into a longer look, a quiet smile became a shared pause, and the hallway between them stopped feeling like a corridor and started feeling like a place. One night, as the hum of the city softened into evening silence, Julian found himself descending the stairs without a purpose. He hadn't planned to go anywhere, hadn't brought a jacket, but his feet led him to the third-floor landing, to the same step where they had once sat with rain outside and tea between them. Victor was already there. No thermos this time, no props, just him, legs stretched out, head tilted back against the wall. He opened his eyes when Julian approached, and something unspoken passed between them. An invitation, a recognition. Julian sat beside him. There were no words at first, and there didn't need to be. The hallway light above them flickered again, as it always did, casting intermittent shadows along the stairwell walls. They sat in that rhythm of flicker and stillness, the soft buzz of electricity filling the spaces left by silence. Julian thought of how far they had come, not in time, but in presence. How something so quiet could feel so complete. He wondered if Victor felt it too, that strange sense of being understood without explanation. Eventually, Victor spoke. Not about feelings, not about the future, but about music. He mentioned a song, something soft and instrumental, that he had listened to on repeat that morning. Julian didn't know it, but he made a mental note to find it later. It felt important, like a clue or a message in disguise. They stayed like that for a long time. Neighbors passed by, some pausing to say hello, some too wrapped in their own lives to notice. No one questioned their presence. No one asked why two grown men were sitting quietly in a stairwell, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Julian found himself leaning slightly closer. Not enough to touch, just enough to feel the warmth of Victor's presence more fully. The distance between them wasn't as necessary anymore. When Victor turned to him, his expression was soft, almost amused. He said something about how strange it was to find comfort in such an ordinary place. Julian nodded. It was strange, but maybe all meaningful things began that way. Quietly, without fireworks. Julian looked down at his hands. They were steady now. No tremble, no tension. For once, his body wasn't bracing itself for rejection or preparing for retreat. He whispered something. Not a confession, not a declaration, but a truth nonetheless. That he didn't know what would come next, but he didn't want to face it alone. Victor didn't respond with words. He just placed his hand over Julian's, warm and certain. A gesture that meant, "You're not." The hallway was quiet again. The light buzzed overhead. The air was cool but not cold. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. What they shared in that stairwell wasn't built on dramatics or sudden passion. It was built on pauses, on proximity, on the kind of quiet that only exists between people who have stopped pretending they don't care. As the night wore on, they sat in silence, just two men in a hall light, sharing a space that had become something else entirely. Something private, something steady, something real. Julian didn't know where this would go or what it would become, but he knew how it made him feel. Less alone, more seen, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He looked at Victor, not with a question, not with fear, just with the calm of someone who had finally stopped running from himself. Victor met his gaze and smiled. In that moment, under the flickering light, nothing else needed to be said.